So much of the dysfunction that we experience in today's workplaces is rooted in the lack of compassion we have for ourselves, our fragile egos, and the way we perceive others as threats. I've been talking about the effects of imposter syndrome for years, but it is much deeper than that. And while my work has primarily focused on women, a giant missing piece of the puzzle is how we understand men's experience. When men are in pain, and so many of them are, they hurt others on small or large scales. What's missing from most of our DEI conversations these days is compassion. And that's why I could not be more excited to speak this week with Sean Harvey, author of the new book, Warrior Compassion: Unleashing the Healing Power of Men. Sean is an organization development consultant, an interfaith minister, and much, much more. One of the things I find most fascinating about his work is the healing work he does with men in hypermasculine systems, such as police forces and even right-wing extremist groups. Here, Sean and I discuss what we're getting wrong about men and how helping men heal will help all of us thrive. Thank you so much, as always, for listening. Welcome to the Impostor Syndrome Files. My name is Kim Meninger, and as an executive coach and former high-tech leader, my personal mission is to help professionals overcome imposter syndrome so that you can advance your career with confidence. Each week, I interview a new guest who brings a powerful perspective to this conversation, including personal stories, best practices, and new insights. The more we talk about this issue, the more we destigmatize imposter syndrome, recognize that we're not alone, and empower ourselves to access the tools and resources that can help us and those around us. Thank you so much for listening and for sharing with others you think would benefit from this conversation. Welcome, Sean. From the moment I met you, I've been waiting to have this conversation, so I'm so grateful that we're finally here. And I would love to start by inviting you to introduce yourself.
All right. You know what? This is imposter syndrome. So, taking off the mask and just being real. I often like to just say I'm a bunny dad first. So I'm a rabbit educator and have my compassion level of compassion has been deepened by fostering or owning 10 bunny rabbits, and being an educator for the shelter. So that juxtaposed to what I do for a living, which is, I'm a change management, organization development professional practitioner. I am an interfaith minister. I'm a men's work guide. And I'm a college professor. And I've been doing this work on some form or fashion, but always along a thread for the last 25 years. But I think what most people, when they read about me, hear is that I went from Wall Street to Eileen Fisher to seminary, and now I work with police and military to deepen compassion in police departments and in hypermasculine systems. So you juxtapose the guy going into hypermasculine systems with a bunny dad, just gives you a sense of what I think is the juxtaposition of when men come into their true selves, the balance between strength and tenderness.
And I think that you paint such an amazing picture, especially with the bunnies, because that just sounds so amazing to me. How did you get here? Like that, the work you're doing is so fascinating and so meaningful. What was the path to this point?
Wow. The way I would describe it, when I came out as a gay man at 15, I was a gay activist at 16. I started the first gay and lesbian youth group for the city of Dayton, Ohio in 1990 when I was 16 years old. That organization still exists today, and I just turned 50, so you can do the math. But for over 30 years, what I would say is, I've had a pretty. I was a kid that was bullied. I was a kid that was always on the outside. I was someone who never felt like I belonged. I think the gift of that is you see the world through a very different lens. You see the world, and what it also does is it when you can start to learn to love yourself, you have a capacity for compassion. And I, over the years, when I would make decisions about my career, if I would go after the money, the title, the fame, the success, I would literally fall on my face within 6 months. It wasn't a good fit. And I was a horrible, it didn't work. But when I would go back and um, really sit in the silence of like, okay, who am I really? I would often think about that experience of starting the gay and lesbian youth group. And I would go, I am a man who's committed to service. And those steps, when I would listen in that to my truth, those steps are what led me here. So those steps are what led me to studying organization development, because I wanted to create change in the world, not just create change in organizations. That led me to move to New York. That led me to become a college professor, and for 10 years. That led me to work for a consulting firm. That led me to start working with Wall Street. And when I was consulting on Wall Street, I created something called socially conscious leadership for emerging talent on Wall Street. And then listening to my heart, when I was 40, I gave it all up. Gave up the vice president job, gave up college teaching, and went to work for Eileen Fisher, the women's fashion company. That's where the journey started, the real journey over the last 10 years. And there were three things I think that really kind of solidified that journey for the path. The first was on my first day. So I'd gone on an 8-month interview. And on my first day, after I got the job, my two bosses sat me down and they said, Sean, we want to acknowledge that you have proven yourself in the interview process. Now we want you to stop proving yourself and learn how to be who you actually are. We want to see the real you. When we interviewed you, you showed us your heart and you showed us your polish. We hired you for your heart and we want to see less of your polish. So, I mean, reality, who says that?
Yeah.
How many people hear that in corporations, and how many men have been told that? Right. So that was really permission. I say that was my permission moment. Then working at Eileen Fisher, I was there for 5 years. I just knew the culture was so strong that I and everyone was transforming, but men in particular were transforming. And they would say things like, and I'd say, hey, yo, I'm changing. Are you changing? And they would say, yeah, I am. My wife said, and it would always start with my wife or my girlfriend said. My wife said that I'm more patient. I listen differently. I stopped needing to be right all the time and I started to be more curious. I started to express myself more. I started to express my emotions more freely. They'd also say, and I noticed that I was more creative and I was able to tap in to solve problems in a new way. But what every one of the men said was, and I feel more comfortable in my own skin. And that's where I knew there was something in the culture. Now, Eileen Fisher also sent me to an artist commune in Canada for 5 months and to learn how to incorporate the arts into creative facilitation. And that's where I heard the call to work with men. Now, you have to understand, I left Wall Street to work for Eileen Fisher in a company that was 83% women because I didn't want to work with men again. I was like, I'm done with this. So the getting the message, no, you're supposed to take all these lessons and bring this to men, which is where I heard the call. I knew this was above my pay grade, and I knew this was a spiritual journey. This was part of the spiritual path. And I knew that, when I look at what's happening in society and the systems around us, the oppressive systems are crumbling around us. And they don't need to be rebuilt. They need to be reimagined from a place of deeper consciousness. When I work backwards, what's the Achilles heel holding that back? the systems that were created and essentially white men in power holding on to power from a place of wounding, not a place of healing. So if we can go to that place and start to heal the wounds, that can create a ripple effect that then can be helpful as we start to transform systems across organizations, across societies. And so that was my motivation, and that was why I went to seminary for one reason, which was to do my spiritual grounding work, to hold space for men to do their spiritual grounding work. Because I believe this work needs to not just be done at a psychological standpoint, but from a spiritual standpoint. And this is a psycho-spiritual approach that I take in the work. Mm-hmm. And that led to, I went to seminary, and then 2 days after I graduated from seminary, or I'm sorry, 2 days before I said my vows, 2 days before I graduated, I got a video. A friend of mine sent me a video, and I was moving from East Harlem, New York to West Asheville, North Carolina. Exactly. A little bit of a different. And it was a video from it was the chief of police. They had just come in and destroyed a medic tent at the Black Lives Matter protest. It made national news. And this was an apology and asking members of the community to be part of police reform efforts in Asheville. And in seminary, they say when you hear the call, you say yes, no matter what. So the next morning, I sent him an email. But I opened up with, I'm moving from Spanish Harlem to New York to West Asheville, North Carolina. And my best friend in London, who's mixed race, will visit me in New York, but won't visit me in Asheville because he's afraid of being murdered by your police. And I said, and I went in to, I understand that most officers are there to truly serve and protect, but at this point, and this was 3 months after George Floyd. So I said, all he sees in Europe is that we kill black men, or police officers kill black men. There's not a lot more context than that over in Europe, that we have here in the States. And flip side of it, I said, because I can't assure him of his safety, I need to be part of this effort. So that led to, because of my background and credentials, I was able to have a one-on-one with the chief of police when I got to Asheville. And he had 2 asks for me in the conversation. He said, 1, Sean, can you help me deepen the level of compassion among my officers? And 2, can you create conversations between community members and officers that humanize each other in a way that they can create a new relationship going forward? I said yes. And unfortunately, Asheville lost 60 to 80 officers in about 6 months to retirements and resignations. So they didn't have the bandwidth. But the way the universe works, a group of us formed an alliance based on that request. And we formed Project Compassion, which is a network of us that are committed to deepening compassion in police departments across the country. So it's myself, the former hostage negotiator for the FBI, the former head of the National Academy of the FBI at Quantico, a military officer who did cultural transformation work with military security forces, and someone from Great Places to Work who's a culture expert, and someone who's worked administratively in Charlotte and Atlanta police departments. And so the group of us came together, and now we're doing this work. And then that work led me to work with military, and that work led me to start working with meeting more avowed white nationalists and far-right extremists, and, just coming through the work. And I now, as a queer progressive minister, tend to work with white nationalists, far-right extremists, and conservatives on how to deepen compassion. And I'm really bringing in the message of love, compassion, and how do we tap into our deeper humanity in those hyper-masculine spaces. And I often say, in trying to reach the hardest to reach and hardest to love men, how can we bring this message of love forward so that we can start to build the bridges that we need to bridge, and through compassion, and how can we start to transform the systems that need to be evolved?
I have so many follow-up questions, but I want to take you back a little
Yeah.
and ask you, because one of the themes that I'm hearing in your story is courageousness, right? Like, how did you manage your own ego throughout so many steps in your journey? I think about you coming out as gay at 15 at a very different time in
Yeah.
history.
Right.
I think about you rejecting or recognizing that if you took jobs for the material trappings, that it wasn't going to make you happy, right? Which is really standing up to society in a way that many people aren't comfortable doing because of especially men, when there's often judgment about, not meeting expectations. The change work that you're doing with, people that a lot of people have written off, right? That just assume that they're just not open to change. Like, as you've gone through your journey, are you conscious of sort of being aware that those were courageous steps? Like, did you struggle at all with them?
Hmm. Or did I struggle? Of course. I mean, I don't talk about I'll talk about the other side of it, in a minute. I don't think I would have named it as courageous. I think where I started this conversation, I saw the world differently. And I was reminded that I saw the world differently. And I think I had to have a different level of acceptance that I was walking a path. I was not included in what most people my age were included in. I didn't have the same experiences. Um, I was ostracized. I was hated. I was bullied. I mean, it was called on stage when I was getting my diploma for my degree, and I'm like praying my mother didn't hear it,
Hmm.
you know. But I also know that I have a really strong inner compass, and I've always been a deep thinker, and I was always a sensitive guy. So I was able probably to attune to things differently than most guys. It's probably why I could see things differently. Um, and so I think it was more survival to do these things and a sense of duty and responsibility than it was courage.
Hmm. Hmm. That's really interesting, because you think about how we are all products of our experiences. And I can imagine with the kind of bullying and hate that you experienced, that could have taken you down a very different path.
Right.
Right?
Well, and so let's talk about that other path though. So what I did, I think in my if I where I was, because I don't think I felt comfortable in my own skin until I started doing my work in my 40s. So I think I always felt like I was an imposter, for up until and probably till my early to mid 40s. Um, and what I mean by that is I knew how to look good on paper. I knew how to get the right credentials. I knew how to get the right achievements. I knew how to network in a very strategic way. So I knew how to make things happen in a way that looked good. I developed a very strong, um, healthy, maybe not so healthy, but very strong, professional life, academic life, professional life that looked good on paper. My personal life was anemic. I didn't attend to my personal life. I think the consequence and cost was I didn't think I deserved a good quality personal life. I didn't deserve a relationship. I didn't deserve quality friendships. And so my professional life was very well developed. My personal life was very anemic. I struggled for years with addiction, be it food, television, sex, drugs. The only thing I don't think I really got into was alcohol. And so and then part of dealing with the addiction and getting to the root, you know? And it really wasn't, even in the times that I tried 12-step programs, it wasn't the 12-step programs that helped me because I was so afraid of being in community. I always thought I was an outsider who wasn't welcome and didn't belong. Right. Which probably allows me to do some of the work that I can do because I understand that experience, not hypothetically, but viscerally. Right. Um, and it's funny because now I'm trying to help heal the type of men that were my bullies.
Yeah.
Right. So the way it comes back around. But it was. I mean, but I also think the suffering that I went through, the struggle I went through behind the scenes that I didn't show the world, that's what has given me the capacity of compassion for the struggles that many men experience. And so being able to just kind of be there and hold space, be there and witness, be there and support without having an agenda. And just allowing these men to be able to connect in a different way. And even when I talk to conservatives or white nationalists, with the common thing I hear is that they find me non-threatening and they feel safe opening up to me.
Why? Why do they talk to you? How do you build trust given the difference in your identity, your beliefs, your experience, right? Like why do they talk to you?
I think one, because I look like them. I think two, because I defy a lot of the stereotypes they might have of a gay man. I think three, because I have an energy that's inviting. I think four, because I've done the work. I think five, because when I see them in their humanity. I don't see them in their views. And I offer an invitation. I think the other part is that I've done a lot of work to integrate the masculine feminine. Or if you don't like that language, I've done a lot of work to just become integrated as a human. And I think for a lot of them that haven't been able to do that integration, they can feel that energy and they're like, there's something there. I'm curious. And then I think also, my story is intriguing and that I'm really, I believe in the work of compassionate bridge building. So I'm not coming in to try to convert. I mean, my boyfriend is a MAGA Republican. So like I'm learning firsthand in so many ways as a progressive, how to make, how to do the bridge building, how to connect, how, even if I am diametrically opposed to the views, that I'm able to be someone who can create an invitation because I can see the humanity, I can see their compassion, I can see the quality of person they are, even if our values don't align.
What role does masculinity play in this conversation? I know you and I talked a little bit about just, I think of it as like the laws of masculinity that keep men trapped in these expectations that don't serve them and certainly don't serve others as well. So how do you see masculinity and its role in a lot of the challenges that we see in men and then the ripple effects beyond that?
Well, I think, masculinity is just a construct that that tells men how, it's coming from all the messages we receive. It's coming from how men have interpreted what it means to be a man. When I think about masculinity and femininity, when I talk to women, I don't hear women talk about the feminine. I hear women being in relationship with the divine feminine or the feminine. I think for men, what I've noticed is a lot of men have taken masculinity as their identity, as opposed to they're in relationship to this construct that is just a construct. But I think that taking it on as an identity, that's where it becomes problematic, and the condition. So I often don't talk about I don't really talk about masculinity that much, because I also know that when I started this work, someone said to me, Sean, there's a professor at one of the UC campuses in California. He said, there's one thing you can never do in this work with men: never sound like a gender studies professor. And part of that, and then it's been confirmed, when you talk about masculinity, men check out of the conversation. Right? But when you talk about the manifestations of what happened, what's going on in their lives, where are they struggling, where are they suffering, you can always pull it back to say, part of our conditioning has constricted us so that we have a limited view of who we actually are. Right? I think that's an easier way in with a lot of guys than talking about masculinity. Because I think what we're seeing is a de-identification that's really hard for a lot of men to grasp, and such a connection to identity that they're afraid of losing that identity, because that identity has given them a value of who they are and their worth. Because I think what we see for a lot of men is that identity and worth come from external factors. There's not a lot of inner work being done until they're ready to do the inner work. But when you really talk to men, when I really talk to men, it's so much of it is the comparison of when I look at other men or other people, what do they have? What do I have? How do I compare? How do I measure up? So when you take the masculinity out, that's my definition of manhood. That's who I am. My self-worth, I'm like, who am I? And that requires men to then start to explore who they are. Right? So I think I think the conditioning plays into this. And I think a lot of the books that are out there on masculinity today, it's still an intellectual exercise. We're intellectually challenging and fine-tuning and wordsmithing and coming up with the new way forward. But I think the reality for a lot of guys is they just need an acknowledgement of their experience. They need an acknowledgement of their pain. They need someone to witness them for who they are in their totality without judgment, and to be able to help them walk from a place of their where they're great, and also where they're in their shadow. Right. And so I think it's seeing them in their whole selves. And I think what we do for each other is we are mirrors and reminders of each other's humanity. In one of the chapters, one of the sections in my book, I talk about seeing the world with childlike wonder. I think part of the work is going back to reclaiming the things that we have rejected because of this conditioning, because of this constriction, where we've lost the aspects of ourselves, our emotionality, our creativity, our capacity for love, our capacity for compassion. Like all of that we had that when we were born. We lost it over time, but we can be reminders of it. And so I think honestly, when men who model what it means to be integrated, what it means to come into our full selves, when we can model that, we can show men that there's another way to be. The key is, I think the other fear besides de-identification is emasculation. And I think a lot of times what I see in a lot of this work is we're either taking a hyper-masculine approach to beat your emotions out of you, or a hyper-feminine approach that demonizes the masculine.
Yeah.
And there's an emasculation that happens that a lot of men are terrified of. So when you can model the integration of strength and tenderness, And it's not one or the other. And that this is what the full humanity can look like. I think to your earlier question, why do they feel safe with me? Why do they talk to me? I think because I model something for them that they don't have that is attractive and shows them there's another way to have more capacity as a human being.
This is just so fascinating. And I think about this a lot. You're working with, extreme versions of men, for lack of a better way of expressing it, right? You're talking about the hyper masculine. I think about this in the everyday workplace. And you and I started to talk about this before we hit record.
Yeah.
I feel like as a society, we have spent a lot of time redefining what it means to be a woman. Mm-hmm. Women had a traditional place in the home, and we've been making progress over years of women have the flexibility to be corporate powerhouses or to work part-time or to stay home with their kids, and any combination thereof. We are now in a place where we are putting a lot of pressure on men to create more space, but we have not redefined what it means to be a man in today's society in a way that makes men feel safe,
right,
to make the kind of compromises that we're asking of them. Right. So I think we operate on these assumptions that, men are fully healthy, and their egos are not fragile, and that there's no pain or insecurity in the male experience in today's workplace, and that they just need to share a little bit more. And so, as we think about how to approach DEI going forward through a more human lens, what are we missing when we leave men out of the conversation, or when we don't acknowledge that men struggle too?
Well, as we were saying earlier, before we got on the call, I think we're not accounting for where men actually are, right? And we are in such a pursuit of inclusion and justice and righting injustice, right? I think one thing we're missing is the compassion and grace in that process. And what does it mean to be inclusive of everyone, and every perspective in their authenticity? And so I think if we look at men, I don't think we've given men space to your point, to grapple with what some of these things mean. And so, I often, when I talk to men around gender and gender equity, before we even get to an equity conversation, we need to just have a conversation around what's your relationship to gender? What's your relationship to your gender? And then let's have a conversation around the shifting rules and roles and expectations around gender, manhood, masculinity, and power. Because men often aren't asked those questions. We're asked about privilege. We're asked about oppression. We're asked about, authenticity. But we're not actually asked pointed questions around, all right, so the world's changing around you. You could be lost, confused, frustrated, angry, or fearful of losing what you've had. Has there been a space for you to even have that conversation around what is and what's changing? And then from there, then to say, and more importantly than do you understand it, how do you feel about it? We don't actually ask men questions a lot of time around how they feel about the things that they're experiencing. Then we can start to say, now let's start to look at what's the impact of that. What's the possibility for that? And then we can start to say, okay, now let's talk about, and to be able to look at this, my belief is this is some hard stuff. This is where we have the compassion. This is where we have if we're going to look at the rawness of some of this and the realities of some of this and the fears and the anger of some of this, and potentially and especially when we talk about the shame of some of this, that's where the compassion and self-compassion work is so needed. to be able to hold it from a place of gentle compassion and humane compassion. And then that modeling could then say, as men have the capacity to have more compassion for themselves, they're going to have more compassion to give into the world. And this is also going to relax the ego enough that then you're not going to be an automatic pilot knee-jerk reaction in your defenses, but you're going to be able to hold and respond to and not just react. And so I think this is part of what can be helpful. And I'm not even sure if, I mean, DEI now is, it feels like it's at a crossroads of where it is, what it wants to be, what it needs to be. What I find when I work with progressives, moderates, or conservatives is that the humanity work, the compassionate humanity work, has a different resonance and is inclusive of inclusion, but it's a bigger pot that really does include everyone. And I think when we can get, I was just in a meeting in DC, sitting with White House officials and funders, and we were talking about how do we create a national initiative to engage men around healthy masculinity. And one of my observations was it was a very progressive group of folks. The challenge was there was an us versus them, progressives and conservatives. The problem is there was a value judgment of which was right and which was wrong. Right? It was implicit. It wasn't that it was explicit so much. But I think the reality is, as we're in these conversations and we want to create these initiatives that include everyone, that we have to get beneath identity and politics, and we have to get to the shared humanity of our collective we. And it just has to be at a different level that I think will create a different type of invitation. And that the other work that needs to happen around how do we right injustice? How do we create space so that all voices can be heard? How do we give a voice to the voiceless? That work is still there. But right now, I think both sides, or we are so polarized and so divided that we're not going to make the progress we want to make to really create a more loving, compassionate, just world in the way that we're doing it right now.
Yeah, I think about that a lot. Of people don't change because they're told that they're wrong.
Right.
People don't change because they're shouted at and not heard, right? And so this is a really important part of this conversation, because if we agree that we are all invested in creating more inclusion for everybody, we have to listen. We have to listen better. And I think that's a part that's missing. And I'm curious if you think, just based on your own experience in the workplace, is there a place for this conversation at work? Do you think it needs to happen outside of work, or can these conversations happen? I'm thinking about it in the way that we have employee resource groups today that focus on different dimensions of identity. And, white men are not often included in a lot of those conversations. Do you see a place for this conversation in today's workplace?
So I'm giving a talk to a power company in a couple of weeks on how to engage men around DEI. And it's been designed for white men that live in rural areas to be able to engage in these conversations. And so, do we create ERGs or affinity groups around men? I often think about it. What if there was a circle around men's well-being? Maybe it's different than the DEI conversation, because I think that has a different intention, right? But at the same time, what if as we're moving into spaces talking about the well-being of employees with burnout, with the lack of engagement, with health issues, with mental health challenges becoming more and more talked about, right? As we look at the increasing levels of suicide rates, as we look at the addiction rates, as we look at the depression rates, the trauma rates, as we take a more informed approach around trauma, that I think to have circles around well-being, to have fireside chats around these types of topics. I think that there is a place for that. I think I think what we're trying to do when I hear about this question, we're trying to fit something in that's into a structure that this may not be the right structure, but there may be another type of circle that could be much more effective, because I think the conversation goes way beyond DEI when we talk about men. I think it goes to identity. I think it goes to self-esteem. I think it goes to pain. I think it goes to struggle. What I find when I work with a group of men, and in my book, the first thing I say, like when I start to give like these are steps to the roadmap for healing for men, the first thing I say is create a community, find safety in the community of men to be able to ugly cry in front of each other and be held by other men, right? To be able to go to that place of vulnerability, to be able to go to that place of honesty. What I find in that space then is men will then talk like a lot of times what we really see for men is for many men, there's an epidemic of loneliness. There's an epidemic of isolation and going it alone. To break that down so that men can start to feel a sense of community, men can start to have relationships, friendships with men at a deeper level. Men can feel safe being open and vulnerable. What they find is like, oh, wow, I'm not the only one suffering with this. I'm not the only one struggling with this. And this, in recovery, they often talk about terminal uniqueness, breaking down that terminal uniqueness, that I'm the only one that has this issue. And then it opens the doors, and then in the work I do with men, I take men on soul adventures, and we go to outdoor adventure where we do deeper male bonding and we have soul connecting conversations. So either philosophical, existential, or spiritual awakening discussions, right? What I like to call practical spirituality for dudes. Because I think a lot of times there's also just a lot of men are in spiritual crisis, and from that standpoint of when I go to a church, what I notice is it's often now 80% women in a church, in many churches that I've gone to, at least mainline churches, maybe not mega churches or evangelical Christian churches. But the majority of women tend to be older. And then my question becomes, so where do men go for spiritual community? Where do men go to have a sense of community that they can, in the way they're living their lives, ask themselves, what's my moral compass? When they're trying to make sense, of what happened this weekend, tragedy, massacres. From a secular perspective, it's one conversation. From a spiritual conversation, that's a whole other dimension of how do you engage in that with others. And so I think that and I think spirituality is starting to make its way to be more mainstream. And we're starting to talk about spirituality in the workplace more. We're starting to talk about love in the workplace more, leading with love. So I think it's still on the fringe for a lot of organizations. And at the same time, it's starting to make its way into organizations more and more. And so I think in this work, there is an opportunity to have spaces for to have the Siri wanted to come in, I guess. We have the opportunity for more of the honest, more of the real conversations.
So I have kind of a final question for you, and then I want to wrap up with where we can find you.
Yeah.
Are you optimistic? I mean, we live in such a polarized country right now that all of the talk is so negative. Everyone's so angry. There's so much hate and vitriol.
Yeah.
You're on the front lines of a lot of this work. Are you optimistic?
I am. I'd say that unequivocally. Because, and I was saying this to someone earlier today, we're seeing a lot of things break down. We're seeing a lot of the old systems break down. We're seeing what's no longer working and serving us in society, in America, in society around the world. We're seeing a push by those who are clinging on to the old to hold on to the old. And yet we're seeing from younger folks and more progressive folks a new way forward, or new ways forward. I think with each tragedy, where I see hope is what comes after the tragedy. Who surfaces, who comes to the surface, who is activated, who is engaged, who has the capacity to be a change agent for what needs to happen in light of the tragedy. And so so yes, I do have hope. I think it's going to get uglier before it gets better. So I'm also not I'm realistic about it. I think we have more breakdowns to happen before we get to the breakthroughs. Right? There's more for us to work through. But at the same time, there's a lot of things that give me hope. There's a lot of things that give me hope around the conscious folks that I see that are committed to this work every day. The attention we're giving to burnout, the attention we're giving to trauma, the attention we're giving to the things that in the past would have taken people out of the equation. And yet we're talking about the self-care so people can stay in the equation. Right. So I think our sophistication is growing. I think there is a committed force of people in the world that want to see powerful change that lifts everyone up. I believe that love will always outweigh fear and hate. And when someone is coming from a place of fear and hate, what I see is a life of suffering. Right? There's an organization that I'm connecting with called Life After Hate, and it's recovering extremists, hate group extremists. And so my question becomes, what is the thing that sparked them to say, I want to live a different life? What is the way that they became disillusioned with their old way of life? So when we talk about the suffering versus anything else, that's an opportunity for healing. And when more and more people have seeds planted to heal, that healing can then start to create a ripple. And I see more and more men committed and being called to work with men around their healing in very different ways today. And then also, I think men's work is at a crossroads because now we have trans and non-binary folks. So it's a whole other idea to say, all right, how does this work with men in light of everything that's shifting around? Mm. So again, going back to how are men navigating the shifts around them?
Yeah.
So that was a long way of saying, yes, I am optimistic.
Well, I'm so grateful to end on a positive note because there's a lot of work to be done. I'm so grateful to you and the work that you're doing and for your willingness to have this conversation with me. Where can people who want more of you find you?
So I think easiest way is to go to my website, warriorcompassion.com. If you want to buy my book, you can go to Amazon. You can either get an ebook or a paperback. And you can always email me at Sean, SEAN, at warriorcompassion.com.
Perfect. Those links will be in the show notes as well. Thank you again, Sean. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to the Impostor Syndrome Files. If you would like to continue this conversation in a safe and trusted space, I would love for you to join my virtual discussion group every Thursday at 12 p.m. Eastern. For the past several years, the group has been limited to women, but it is now open, regardless of gender, to anyone who is interested in exploring and troubleshooting common workplace challenges, building better awareness of ourselves and others, and becoming more inclusive allies at work. Check out the show notes for more info on how to find us, and please join us next week for another episode of the Impostor Syndrome Files.